Greetings to all our viewers tuning into our channel. Right from the start of this month, as international media flooded the airwaves with news about the US suddenly raising tariffs from 25% to 35% on a slew of imported goods, many believed that North America was on the brink of an unprecedented trade storm. Headlines screamed with drama, Washington in fury, last-minute ultimatum, Canada backed into a corner. But amid all that noise, all those blood-red forecast charts and opinion pieces claiming Canada couldn't possibly hold out, Ottawa remained almost completely silent. An unusual silence. A calm so deliberate, it made people stop and wonder, what is Canada thinking? Aren't they worried? That was the moment that made everyone sit up. Because at first glance, it was easy to mistake Canada's silence for a lack of response, as if they were being swept up by a crisis triggered by the US. But in truth, the most dangerous move on the chessboard isn't the one that's loud and forceful. It's the one made by a player who knows exactly where their strength lies and doesn't feel the need to flaunt it. Ottawa's silence was a signal. They had been preparing for this for a long time. They understood the true limits of tariff threats, and more importantly, they were fully aware of their position within the region's trade structure. While Washington ramped up the pressure with aggressive statements and relentless deadlines, Ottawa chose to stand apart from the noise. No rebuttals, no race to respond, no getting swept into the high-stress rhythm the US was trying to impose. That wasn't passivity, that was strategy. Because Canada knows that in this game, psychology is what really matters. The one who shows fear first loses first. And when Canada refused to panic, when they didn't buy into the artificial sense of urgency that Washington was crafting, all that psychological pressure instantly lost its power. In fact, this very composure exposed a critical vulnerability in the US, their deep dependence on the North American supply chain, so deep that they can't truly hurt Canada without hurting themselves. Ottawa's calm wasn't born from luck or blind optimism. It was built on decades of tightly woven trade structures. A framework so integrated that even the US can't simply unravel it at will. And that's where the story gets interesting. Because to understand why Canada can hold its ground, why Washington's threats make noise but carry little weight, we need to dive into something deeper, the true nature of this tariff war, and why, no matter how much they want to, the US simply can't use tariffs to pressure Ottawa. Let's move on to the next part, the tariff war. Why the US can't pressure Canada? There's a little-known truth. In every trade confrontation over the past 30 years, the US has always been the one to strike first. But this time, despite all the loud declarations, despite raising tariffs to 35% and using language heavy with intimidation, Washington has failed to apply any real pressure on Ottawa. And that's what stunned observers. The tariff weapon that the US believed was supreme turned out to be nothing more than a blunt blade when aimed at Canada. To understand why the US has lost its footing, we need to look at the bigger picture. Because this tariff war isn't just about a few percentage points. It's a clash between two economic models, two supply chain structures that have been interwoven across borders like vital arteries for nearly half a century. When President Trump announced sweeping tariff hikes on everything from agricultural goods and minerals to electronics and automobiles, analysts predicted a wave of chaos. And chaos did follow, but not in Canada, as many had expected. The EU had to sign deals to dodge tariffs. Japan was forced to make concessions to protect its market. South Korea and Taiwan began shifting parts of their supply chains to Mexico to reduce risk. But Canada? Canada stood almost entirely outside the storm, simply observing and entirely unmoved. The reason lies in the very structure of North American trade. Over 70% of Canada's exports to the US fall under the USMCA, the regional trade framework that replaced NAFTA in 2020. This agreement not only exempts most goods from tariffs, but also creates a supply chain network so deeply integrated that any hit aimed at Canada would ricochet straight back at the US. Analysts have dubbed this phenomenon the boomerang tariff, a tax that swings back at the one who imposes it. Nowhere is this more evident than in the auto industry. A fully assembled car rolling off the line in Ontario might include an engine made in Ohio, a transmission from Michigan, semiconductors from Texas, and a chassis from Quebec. These parts cross the border multiple times, going through dozens of assembly stages. If the US slaps a tariff on Canada, it's essentially slapping a tariff on its own components. And Ottawa knows this better than anyone. In agriculture, some US regions are entirely dependent on fertilizers, minerals, and energy sourced from Canada. In the steel and aluminum sectors, Canada is a critical link in the supply chains that support US defense manufacturing. In fact, many American companies have set up factories in Canada to benefit from lower taxes and access to clean energy, a competitive edge the US has yet to match. So when Washington tries to project the illusion that it can squeeze Canada with tariffs, any analyst familiar with the North American supply chain knows immediately. It's an empty threat, symbolic at best, not a functional weapon. Another key reason the US can't corner Canada lies in their differing strategic objectives. Washington uses tariffs as political leverage to force countries into deals that serve American interests. But Canada doesn't need that kind of transaction. They're not playing the political game. They're playing the structural game. And that's something the US can't simply rewrite, no matter how badly it wants to. The more Washington hikes tariffs, the more damage it inflicts on its own industries. From auto plants to battery supply chains to green energy factories, they all need Canada. Imposing tariffs on Canada is like the US cutting off its own oxygen. And that brings us to a fascinating truth. In this confrontation, real power doesn't lie in who shouts the loudest, it lies in who has the most resilient structure. And Canada owns that structure. That's also why when the US tried to apply pressure with rhetoric, Ottawa took the opposite route: silence. No rush. No display of worry. No reactions that might validate the effectiveness of Washington's tariffs. That non-response, which may appear weak on the surface, is actually a soft but razor-sharp counterstrike. Because if the US uses noise to shake confidence, Canada uses stillness to expose the true limits of its opponent. And it's from this point that Ottawa's high-level strategy begins to reveal itself. To understand why not reacting has become Canada's most powerful weapon in this tariff war, we invite you to join us in the next segment, Ottawa's non-reaction strategy. In previous crises, whenever the US turned up the pressure, the Canadian government would usually respond with strong messaging, emergency press conferences, official protests, and firm declarations about protecting national interests. But this time, nothing. Ottawa chose to remain still. An almost total silence. No harsh statements, no warnings, not a single move that suggested they were under stress. And the strange thing is, the quieter they stayed, the stronger they seemed. This non-reaction wasn't because they didn't know what was happening. On the contrary, it was a carefully calculated tactic. Ottawa understood that Washington's strategy depended on creating a sense of panic, on generating instability, on cultivating a feeling of urgency that would force other countries to scramble under the pressure of US-imposed deadlines. But Canada refused to fall into that emotional trap. They didn't react, and that instantly neutralized America's psychological leverage. Behind the scenes, however, Canada's government was far from idle. Their preparation was happening silently, methodically, without haste, and without giving away a single signal. The Ministry of Finance ran models simulating hundreds of different scenarios. The Ministry of Trade analyzed the impact on every product line, every factory, every region. The Economic Advisory Council met continuously to map out long-term risk forecasts, yet all of this unfolded behind closed doors. To the public and the business community, Ottawa appeared calm, but behind that calm was a machine operating with precision and extreme discipline. That type of response sent a clear message. Canada would not let itself be emotionally manipulated by the US. They would act only on data, logic, and long-term strategy. Another critical element in the non-reaction strategy was Canada's deliberate decision not to let Washington know what they were worried about. When a country can't pinpoint its opponent's weaknesses, it doesn't know where to strike, and that is a massive strategic advantage. If Ottawa had spoken out in protest, Washington might have thought, they're scared. If Ottawa had conceded early, the US would have pushed even harder. But when Ottawa remained completely silent, the US lost its footing. They threw a punch, but saw no reaction. And when a blow has no psychological effect, it's the one throwing it who starts to lose composure. That silence also gave Canada a second advantage. It reinforced domestic confidence. When citizens see their government isn't worried, they don't worry either. When businesses see their leaders not reacting emotionally, they know a well-thought-out strategy is already in place. This creates a stability zone, something far more valuable than any economic policy in times of turbulence. Instead of responding with words, Canada responded with patience. And that patience dismantled Washington's pressure tactics. The US wanted to turn this into a psychological showdown, but Ottawa turned it into a contest of structure and resilience. When you remain unshaken by crashing waves, people realize it's because you're standing on solid ground. However, this non-reaction strategy didn't just help Canada withstand diplomatic pressure. It created a much deeper effect, a ripple that extended down to the very foundation of society, the lives of ordinary people and the business community. Because in any trade conflict, the question that matters most to the public is, how does this affect me? What will I lose? What will I gain? And when Canada chose calm over panic, the way that impact was felt by citizens and companies became a far more interesting story. Because what makes a country strong isn't just a government that stands firm, but a population that does too. To understand the real extent of the impact and to see who is under more pressure in this standoff, the Canadian people or the American people, we invite you to the next segment. Impact on citizens and businesses. Who's feeling the pressure more? In any trade war, one question always surfaces before all the economic analyses. How will this affect ordinary people? And what about businesses, the ones directly responsible for jobs and livelihoods? How will they adapt? Because tariffs, though presented in dry numbers and reports, flow straight into the daily lives of families. A car that suddenly costs a few $1,000s more, a grocery basket that jumps 10 to 15% in price, or a factory shelving expansion plans because of too many unknowns. Surprisingly, in this latest crisis, Canadian citizens not suffer the kind of shock many experts had predicted. While countries across the globe scrambled to adjust prices, tighten production, or cut orders in response to US tariffs, Canada's economy maintained an almost steady heartbeat. The reason lies in something often seen as a weakness: Canada's heavy dependence on the US market. But that very entanglement turned out to be a shield against short-term shocks, because most Canadian goods fall under the USMCA framework, which renders US tariff hikes largely ineffective. Canadian consumers weren't hit with sudden car price spikes like in Europe or Japan. Canadian agriculture wasn't squeezed like Argentina's or Brazil's. Battery plants in Ontario, Windsor, and St. Thomas didn't face double tariffs like their counterparts in South Korea or Thailand. Everything remained in a state of remarkable stability while much of the world was thrown off balance. Ironically, it was the American people who felt the first wave of impact. Car prices climbed. Food imported from South America became more expensive. Electronics components from Asia were taxed more heavily, sending laptop, phone, and appliance prices upward. US factories, dependent on parts from Canada and Mexico, had to pause some production lines to recalculate costs. The economic headwinds that were expected to hit Canada instead turned around and blew straight into the American economy. Among the business community, the contrast was even sharper. In the US, many companies postponed investment plans, unsure how tax policy might change next week or next month. Political volatility was eroding business confidence in their own domestic market. Meanwhile, Canadian companies received a very different signal. We won't change policy just because of emotional waves coming from across the border. That message, though never spoken out loud, provided more stability than any stimulus package could. Many economists call this the consistency advantage, an intangible asset that's incredibly valuable. When a country maintains consistent policies, businesses can plan long-term. When businesses can plan long-term, the economy is better equipped to weather external shocks. And this very advantage is what's making Canada stand out amid a chaotic global moment. But perhaps the most fascinating effect is psychological. When people see their government staying calm, they don't rush to hoard goods. When businesses see a government that's not panicking, they don't shut down production lines or lay off workers. The government's composure radiates into society, helping the entire economy stay upright instead of crumbling under fear. However, Canada's story isn't just about suffering less damage than the US. What's happening is far bigger. As Canada holds steady, the world is starting to view them as a new anchor in a shifting economic order. The trade war hasn't just exposed America's vulnerabilities, it has inadvertently elevated Canada to a position it has never held before. A country that can stand apart from Washington's pressure and still retain the trust and respect of the international community. And this is the moment when the global picture begins to shift. The world is quietly realigning its course, and Canada, naturally and convincingly, is emerging as a new anchor of stability. To understand why that is happening, we invite you to the next segment. The World Recalibrates, Canada's Role in the New Global Order. When we look beyond North America, we begin to see just how quickly the global landscape is shifting. For 3 decades after the Cold War, the world operated under an unspoken assumption. The United States was the center of trade, the standard setter, the economic hub around which all others revolved. But now, with growing political volatility and wave after wave of disruption coming from Washington, many nations are starting to ask, can we still rely on the US the way we once did? What was once taken for granted has become a serious question, and that question is driving a wave of quiet but powerful adjustments. From Tokyo to Berlin, from Seoul to Brasilia, governments are reassessing their trade strategies. One common realization is emerging across the board. Excessive dependence on the US is a liability, and that liability is growing by the year. In that context, Canada has emerged as a stable oasis in a sea of global turbulence, a nation with consistent politics, an open market, deep trade ties without conflict, and most importantly, one that doesn't use trade as a political weapon. What the US now does, Canada doesn't. What the US demands through pressure, Canada earns through trust. This shift is no coincidence. It reflects a very real global need, the need for a reliable partner. In a world where national strategies can pivot with a single tweet, where election cycles throw long-term plans into chaos, the world is craving stability, and Canada, through its quiet, steady presence, has become an ideal destination. Just look at the investment pouring into Canada, and the trend becomes clear. The global electric vehicle sector, where corporations are pulling out of China due to rising political risk, is betting big on Canada. Tens of billions of dollars are being funneled into battery production, rare earths, and EV manufacturing in Ontario, Windsor, and St. Thomas. And it's not just because of the domestic market. It's because Canada is now seen as the anchor point in the North American supply chain, the safe bet in an increasingly chaotic world. And it's not just the West taking notice. Japan, South Korea, and the EU are expanding trade relations with Canada, even viewing it as a stable backdoor into the US market. In South America and Africa, regions that previously traded almost exclusively with Washington, countries are now looking to sign trade agreements with Ottawa, not because Canada is more powerful than the US, but because it is more neutral, more predictable. Even more notable is how Canada is subtly expanding its soft power. There are no flashy diplomatic tours, no pressure tactics, no strings attached. But Canada is building trust in a different way, through consistency in word and action. When Ottawa commits to a policy, they keep it. When they sign a deal, they don't shift their position just because the political winds change. And to investors, that's worth more than any tax break. Another key factor in Canada's rise as a new axis of stability is its clean energy strategy. While the world struggles with oil prices, geopolitical conflicts, and the transition to renewables, Canada possesses a large, sustainable, and steady supply of clean energy. That electricity not only powers homes, it attracts manufacturing plants that require reliable energy, something the US is still struggling to provide. But perhaps the most important factor isn't tied to any single industry. It's in how the world is now viewing Canada. As a trusted partner, arriving just as the global system is running low on trust. While Washington grows erratic, Beijing asserts power in ways that make others uneasy, and Europe juggles conflict and recession, Canada stands out as a partner that is easy to work with, easy to predict, and easy to believe in. And here we see a remarkable paradox. Canada doesn't need to compete for position. It just needs to hold its ground. The world is adjusting toward it. The new global order isn't being shaped by the loudest nation, but by the most stable one. And within that stability, Canada is quietly stepping into a role it never dreamed of occupying. But this global realignment also reveals something the United States would rather not admit. Because Canada's rise isn't the result of newfound strength, it's the result of America's decline in the very areas global trade values most: consistency, trustworthiness, and the ability to uphold rules. To understand this more deeply, we invite you to the next segment, the Tariff War and America's hidden weakness. The tariff war that Washington launched to project strength has, ironically, revealed a hard-to-accept reality. The United States, despite being the world's largest economy, is lacking the one thing global trade needs most: stability. And that instability doesn't stem from economic capacity, but from the ever-shifting way America sets its policies. From the outside, the US still looks like a superpower, a massive market, a leader in technology, a financial giant. But once drawn into a tariff war, Washington exposed a weakness no nation ever wants to show: inconsistency. With every change in administration comes a change in direction. A trade agreement can be nullified with a single statement. A long-term commitment can vanish after one election cycle. Partners are left uncertain, not knowing what might happen next week, next month, or next year. And that is the greatest fear in trade. And that fear has cost America the soft power it once held. Instead of being seen as a reliable economic anchor, the US is increasingly viewed as an unpredictable variable. And when the world's biggest variable becomes unstable, every country starts finding ways to reduce dependence. From Europe to Asia, corporations are quietly shifting supply chains away from the US to hedge against policy risk, a trend that 10 years ago would have been unthinkable. Yet here it is, happening just as America thought it could pressure the world with tariffs. When Washington called businesses home, many U.S. firms didn't return. Instead, they moved to Mexico for lower costs and greater supply chain stability. Others chose Canada, where there are no policy shocks. Still others turned to Europe or Southeast Asia, regions offering more long-term consistency. And therein lies the greatest paradox: U.S. Tariffs didn't bring supply chains back, they pushed them further away. Meanwhile, America's rivals, particularly China, have seized this moment to reinforce their strategic advantages. Despite facing internal challenges, China remains committed to long-term strategies in industry, energy, and exports. They don't overhaul their national direction because of one political cycle or one election. And to many nations, that kind of consistency has become a competitive edge, even if it comes from a very different system. This doesn't mean China is stronger than the US, but it highlights that America is weakening itself, not through lack of power, but through too much volatility. And when the US no longer serves as the lighthouse of stability for the global economy, the world starts searching for new anchors, and Canada is now one of them. Perhaps the most sobering truth for Washington is this: tariffs, once a symbol of American strength, are now backfiring. They haven't changed Canada's behavior. They haven't forced other nations into greater concessions. They haven't brought production back to American soil. All they've done is erode America's image as a trustworthy partner, an intangible yet critical asset in global trade. This tariff war, then, has delivered a powerful lesson. The strength of a nation isn't just measured by the size of its economy, but by its ability to remain consistent, to sustain trust, and to show the world that others can rely on it. And at the very moment the U.S. lost those things, Canada began to strengthen its position through a calmness many once mistook for weakness. In a chaotic world, true strength doesn't always come from the loudest voice. It often comes from the one who stands firm the longest. And in this trade war, Canada has proven that with quiet, convincing force. Ladies and gentlemen, as we look back on the full arc of this tariff showdown, one truth becomes strikingly clear. Something that may seem simple at first glance, yet carries immense strategic weight. True strength doesn't lie in who speaks the loudest, but in who can remain calm the longest. While Washington stirred up waves with bold declarations and forceful rhetoric, Ottawa chose to stand firm amid the storm, unshaken by emotion, refusing to react impulsively, and never allowing itself to become a hostage to fear. That calmness, which might appear passive on the surface, is in fact Canada's own unique form of power, a quiet power, not flashy or loud, but resilient and deeply rooted. It comes from thorough preparation, from confidence in the North American trade structure, and from the sharp understanding that tariffs only work when the other side is afraid of them. And this time, Canada was not afraid. In today's volatile world, power is no longer defined by threats, skyrocketing tariffs, or showy displays in the media. Power is defined by consistency, composure, and trustworthiness, qualities that Canada has demonstrated convincingly throughout this tense chapter. If you have thoughts on how Canada has handled this North American trade conflict, we'd love to hear from you. Share your perspective in the comments below. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our in-depth coverage of global geopolitics and economics. Thank you so much for watching.